Okay, so I wanted to get on here and do a short little video on genetics, which is the last bit of the presentation for the blood typing lab. That blood typing lab is very long and it's hard to get through everything. So I just decided to make a video on genetics that you can watch before we come back for part one. That way we can stay caught up. So genes, you should already know genes is a portion of DNA that codes for a specific protein. Okay, so again, a gene is a portion of DNA that codes for a specific protein. Okay, or you can also say a gene is a portion of DNA that determines specific traits. And those specific traits are determined by proteins. So, what we mean by genes is we have genes for eye color, we have genes for your blood type, we have genes for determining whether you have a widow's peak, which is where you have your hairline come to a point at the top, or you have a straight hairline. So there's a gene that determines that. There's also a gene for height. Actually, a few different genes code for height. So those are genes. Those are examples of genes. So, and pretty much every physical trait you have is determined by genes, either a gene or a combination of genes. So there are terms to distinguish between an organism's physical traits, which is what you actually see. So the brown versus blue eyes, the A versus B versus AB versus O blood type, and so on and so forth. So there you have the physical trait, which is what you see, versus the genetic makeup. So what are the actual genes saying? Hey, what is the sequence of nucleotides or the sequence of codons that are determining this particular trait? So an organism's genetic makeup, or that portion of DNA, what the DNA actually says, is what we call the genotype. Okay, and if it'll go to the next one, an organism's physical trait, what you actually see is the phenotype. So the genotype determines the phenotype. Okay, so you can write that down. The genotype determines the phenotype. So what the DNA says is going to determine what that person looks like or what that physical trait is going to be. Okay, and then you actually have different versions of genes. So alleles are different versions of genes. So the version of the eye color gene that codes for brown eyes versus the gene that codes for the allele, the version of that gene that codes for, did I say brown first? Then blue, whichever other one that I said. So you'll have a version that codes for brown and a version that codes for blue. You have a version that codes for the widow's peak when it comes to that gene that determines hairlines, and you'll have there'll be another version that exists of that gene for a straight hairline. Trying to think of another one. Oh, the curling of the tongue. So if you can curl your tongue into like a little burrito or taco, whatever they say, that's actually determined by a gene too. So you'll have a version that allows for rolling the tongue in that way, and then one version of that gene that doesn't allow for that. Okay, so those are alleles. Okay, and you get those different versions of the alleles from your parents. So you'll get one version of a gene from mom, and then you'll get another version of the gene from dad. And actually, it could be the same. It could be the same, or it could be different. And we'll talk about that in a second. So you get so what you're looking at right now on the screen is what we call a karyotype. A karyotype is just basically a visual image of all 23 pairs of your chromosomes. So you should know that you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of them are your non-sex chromosomes. They're called autosomal chromosomes. You don't have to know that term, but these are your non-sex chromosomes. And then you have the last pair, which is your 23rd pair, and that is your sex chromosomes. So if you're a male, you'll have an X and a Y chromosome, and then if you're female, you'll have two X chromosomes. Okay, so again, 23 pairs, one set of that pair, or one set of those 23 pairs came from dad, the other set came from mom. So here's an example of a mom and dad. So this is me and my husband, and then our two children. Um, they may look a little similar, but they're completely different. Now that they're grown a little bit older, one is 8 and the other one is 12. Now that they're older, you can really, really see the differences. So even though my DNA is my DNA and dad's DNA is dad's DNA, during meiosis, and we'll get into this a little bit later, there's a crossing over of genes that occurs and a randomness that occurs of shuffling all these genes around and versions of genes. And then one egg meets one sperm and fertilizes, and you get one random assortment of genes. And then when it happens again for another child, it's a different random assortment of genes. So this is why no two kids, unless they're identical, look the same. You're always going to be able to find differences. Okay, so a little bit about genetics, but I want to get into some like practical like application and practice on how to determine or how to show how genotype determines phenotype. So one thing I want to say is that we have different versions of genes. We already talked about that. Those are called alleles. But you can have a dominant allele for a gene and a recessive allele for a particular gene. Now, this is for very simple genes. Like I said, there are some times where there are more than one gene that codes for a particular trait, and there's other complicated aspects of genetics, but we're going to talk about the simple forms of determining genetics and how genotypes determine phenotypes. So if you have a dominant version of a gene, the dominant allele is what is expressed. So if you have a dominant version of a particular gene, that dominant allele is going to get expressed. So what is expressed? And if you have a recessive allele, this may be hidden or masked in the presence of a dominant allele. So what I mean by that is, let's say we were talking about eye color. So let's say and eye color is actually one of the ones where multiple genes are going to code for eye color, which is why you can get like hazel eyes that maybe have specks of green, or you can have different like variations of color in that way. But we're going to simplify it. So let's say the dominant gene or dominant allele, actually, this is the dominant version of that gene, codes for brown hair. Okay, let's say the recessive allele or recessive version of that gene codes for blue eyes. Okay, so brown eyes versus blue eyes. And brown is dominant, blue is recessive. So because you get one version of the gene from mom and one version of the gene from dad, you can end up with a few different combinations. So let's say if you have two versions or two dominant versions of that gene, or two dominant copies of that allele, or two copies of that allele that happen to be dominant, then that person or that baby is going to end up with brown eyes. If you have two copies of the recessive allele, so two lowercase b's, and one thing to know is that we always denote the dominant version of a gene or the dominant allele by using a capital letter. We always denote a recessive allele by a lowercase letter. So if you have two copies of the recessive allele, then of course you're going to have blue eyes. And the reason for that is if you have a blue copy and a blue copy, you're going to end up with blue eyes. If you have a brown copy and a brown copy, you're going to end up with brown eyes. Where the dominance comes into play is if you have a big B and a little b. So you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So you have one dominant version of that gene and one recessive version of that gene. And what's going to happen, like I said, dominant is what is expressed, recessive may be hidden or masked in the presence of a dominant allele. So if you have a dominant and a recessive, you're going to end up with brown eyes, because brown is the dominant version of that gene. That is what's going to get expressed, and it's going to be the blue-eyed trait that's going to get masked or hidden. So that person's going to end up with brown eyes. Okay, another example is the widow's peak that I talked about. So when your hairline comes to a point. So if I were to draw a person, that would be like this, where they have a little widow's peak, versus a straight hairline where it's just like that. Okay, so let's say, so the widow's peak is actually dominant. So, and I'll just write peak, but we know it's a widow's peak. So the capital letter will be the dominant version of that gene, remember? So the big W is the widow's peak, because the widow's peak is a dominant trait. The recessive trait is then the straight hairline, and we'll use a lowercase w for that. Okay, so the different combinations you can have are two dominant versions. That person will end up with a widow's peak. You can have two recessive copies, and then that person will end up with a straight hairline. Or you could have one of each, and because the widow's peak is the dominant trait, it's the one that's going to get expressed while the other one's going to be hidden. This person will end up with a widow's peak. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, to determine blood type, the kind of genetics that determines blood type is a little bit more complicated. Blood typing, or blood types, are determined by something called codominance. So what that means is that two dominant alleles may both be expressed simultaneously. I don't know why I put such a big space between the L and T, but simultaneously. So, with codominance and with blood typing, A is a dominant allele. Actually, and I'll do it this way, actually. So our dominant alleles dominant alleles are A and B, and our recessive is O. So what that means is, if you have, obviously for type A, if you have two copies of A, you're going to be type A. If you have two copies of B, you're going to be type B. And remember, one copy comes from mom and one copy comes from dad. And then obviously, if you have two copies of O, you're going to be type O. Now, what if you have a combination of a dominant and a recessive? So let's say you have A and O. So if you have A and O, what gets expressed is the dominant one, while the recessive one gets hidden or masked. So a type A could also be A and O, where they get A from maybe mom and O maybe from dad. Okay. And then another for type B would be having that dominant allele B and then having the recessive O. Because again, it's going to be B that gets expressed, the O is hidden, so that person ends up being type B. The only way to get a recessive trait to show with type O is you have to have two copies of the recessive allele. That's the only way to do it. So there's only one combination that works for type O. And then for type AB, obviously you'll have one copy of A, one copy of B. Both are expressed. Okay, you have both the A antigen and the B antigen showing on the surface of that person's red blood cells. So they are type AB. Okay, this would be a red blood cell with an A antigen, a red blood cell with a B antigen, red blood cell with no antigens because it's type O, and then type AB will have both A and B. Okay. So the next slide. So hopefully, if you need us to write more of this down, just press pause. But the next slide. So the phenotypes for dad is type A, mom is type B. Their genotypes. So as we looked at before and saw what combinations could determine type A blood, type B blood, type O blood, and type AB blood. So we already know that if dad's type A blood, he could either be a combination of two A's or an A and an O. If mom has type B blood, she could be a combination of two B's or a B and an O. Okay, because remember, if a recessive allele is present, it's the dominant one that gets shown, and O is always going to be recessive. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use something called Punnett squares to determine the genotypes, and we'll use that to figure out the phenotypes of these two parents' children. So how you do that is you're going to put one parent's genotype on one side and then one parent's genotype on the other side. It doesn't matter which one is on which side. Okay, mom could have been on top and dad could have been on the side. It didn't really matter. Okay, so you don't have to worry about which one goes on which. You can do either one on either side. It really doesn't matter. So let's say that dad was AA. So if dad was AA, we know he's type A, so he could either be AA or AO. So let's just use the combination AA for this one. And let's say mom was BB. Okay. In this case, so how you do these Punnett squares is you're going to, for each one of these, you're going to bring down the A and bring over the B. Bring down the A and bring over the B. So if you have parents, okay, where the dad is AA and the mom is BB, how we determine what the kids could be is filling out this Punnett square. So here, dad would give an A, mom would give the B. Dad would give the A, mom would give the B. We bring the A down here and the B over here. Then dad would give the A, mom would give the B. And again, the last one, dad would give the A, mom would give the B. Okay, this one goes over here and then over here. Okay, so then this makes sense, right? All their kids would be AB. That would mean that they were type AB. Okay, 100% of them are type AB. Because dad only has an A to give, so all of his sperm are going to have A. Mom only has B to give, so all of her eggs are going to have B. Sperm and egg come together, and every one of those combinations are going to be an A and a B because that's all each parent has to give. Okay. So the next example would be if dad was AO and mom was BO. So this is going to have different combinations here because we're dealing with now three different letters instead of just two. So in this box would be an A and a B from here, and here. Okay. And then the next box to the right is going to be a B from mom and an O from dad. Next box on the bottom left would be an A from dad and an O from mom. And then the last one is actually an O from dad and an O from mom. So it's actually each one of these is a different combination. So 25% of their offspring are going to have AB type. 25, and I should say type AB, but you know what I mean. 25% are going to be BO type. Stop doing that. And then the next 25% are going to be, well, I guess not. That's not the type. That's the genotype. Sorry, my bad. These should be their phenotype. So this is going to be B type for the AO for the BO. Or again, why am I doing the letter first? Sorry, guys. So type A for the combination AO. And the last one, the last 25% is type O for the combination OO. Okay. And this is really bothering me, so I do want to switch it around. So type AB, obviously for the AB combination, type B for the BO combination, type A for the AO, and type O for the OO. So 25% chance of having each one of these types for each children. Okay, the next combination is AA. And remember, these are the genotypes. This is a phenotype. So the genotypes for that second combination we did, the genotype possibilities are AB, BO, AO, and OO. And so the phenotypes are type AB, type B, type A, and type O blood. Okay. So the next combination is if dad is AA again, and now mom is BO. Okay. How these would work: A and B here, A and B here, A and O here, and A and O here. So each combination is going to have an A, of course, because dad only has an A to give in this situation. But the second letter, okay, can be either a B or an O because mom has both B and O's to give. Now, you should know typically an A is always going to be listed first because we don't ever have type BA. We call it type AB, not BA. So always put the A first if there's an A and a B together. So the different phenotypes that this could have is that 50% of them are going to be type AB, and another 50% of them are going to have type A from the AO combination or the AO genotype. Okay, so the AO genotype determines the type A blood type, which is a phenotype. And then our last combination is if dad was AO and mom was BB. In this case, AB here, BO here, AB here, and BO here. And this one makes sense because, or every one of these combinations is going to have a B because mom only has a B to give. Okay? And then the first letter, or the first or the second letter, depending on your combination, but each one of these combinations could have an A or an O because dad has each one of those to give. So in this one, it's 50% type AB blood. So 50% of their offspring are going to be AB on average, just statistically is how it should be. And then 50% of them should have the phenotype of having type B blood from the BO combination. Okay, so this would be how you determine the genotype and phenotype based on the genotype and phenotypes of the parents. So this is what this could be a short answer on your first exam. Is not all of these. I'm not gonna have you do. Well, actually, it wouldn't be this exact one. It could be some kind of other combination or other type of question like this, where it's like, we're actually, how could I ask you? It could be a couple different things. I could just say, hey, this is dad's phenotype, this is mom's phenotype. What are the possibilities of genotypes for their kids? Most likely, I would give you the genotype and at least one of the or the phenotypes and at least one of the genotypes. And if you have any questions on these, come to office hours. We can do some practice ones in office hours. Also, we will have some review days at the end of this unit when we get to closer to the exams. So we can also do practice problems during that time. I think there might be a practice problem like this on a Kahoot. I'm not sure. And then I'm sure your pal will do a couple practice ones of these at their session when you go over genetics. So this is the genetics portion of that blood typing lab. I wanted to keep it short, but then again, if I kept it short, then we wouldn't be able to do as much practice. So if videos are ever too long, you could always speed them up to like 1.5 or 2 is kind of fast. But 1.25 or 1.5 if you're really pressed for time. But I do like to do a lot of practice so that you guys can get the idea. Here are some 2 different practices. Practice problems, application practice problems for blood typing. So a woman who is A positive has rushed to the ER with severe hemorrhaging and needs transfusions. What blood types could she safely receive and what blood types could she not receive? Enter all that apply and explain your reasoning for each. And keep in mind that transfusion consists of erythrocytes only and saline, no plasma. So remember, you get your red blood cells washed before you would receive them. So this is just a example, or this would be just a practice of what a person can receive. So try to do this like without your notes. So after you've practiced blood typing a few times and gone through that chart that you made in the lab about who can receive what blood and who can donate to who, then come back and try to figure this out yourself. The second application is someone who's B plus can donate blood to which blood type. So again, this is just that same table that you did for lab, but now it's applying it. So study it first and then try to do these on your own. If you have any questions, of course, reach out to me. Okay, bye.